to our last installment in our series of reflections on John Paul II's encyclical, Ecclesia de Eucharistia. In the last part of this encyclical, he addresses some of the difficult, even painful questions which surround the Eucharist. For example, how come, under certain conditions, the Church says that some of our brothers and sisters cannot receive communion? We will look at part 4 of the encyclical, sections 34 to 46, to explore some of these questions. John Paul II writes about the Eucharist as a sacrament of communion, as the sacrament of communion. He says the Church is called to maintain and promote communion with the triune God and communion among the faithful. For this purpose, she possesses the Word and sacraments, particularly the Eucharist. It is not by chance that the term communion has become one of the names given to this sublime sacrament. A sacrament is a sign and instrument of grace. If the Eucharist is a sign of the communion of the people of God, it points to communion that already exists. Therefore, John Paul II writes, the celebration of the Eucharist cannot be the starting point for communion. It presupposes that communion already exists, a communion which it seeks to consolidate and bring to perfection. When this communion is broken, the sacrament would be a false or misleading sign. It would claim to demonstrate communion where it is in fact lacking. Let's consider two such situations. John Paul II writes that when a Catholic has freely and willingly committed a serious wrong, a mortal sin, that they are called to receive the sacrament of reconciliation before receiving the Eucharist. This stems from the reality of the Eucharistic celebration, which, as we have discussed previously, is where the sacrifice of the cross is truly present. John Paul writes, because the Eucharist makes present the redeeming sacrifice of the cross, it naturally gives rise to a continuous need for conversion. If a Christian's conscience is burdened by serious sin, then the path of penance through the sacrament of reconciliation becomes necessary for full participation in the Eucharistic sacrifice. God works through the sacraments, but not without inviting our consent and cooperation. We cooperate by heeding the call to conversion, by seeking reconciliation, so that we can be restored to the full communion which the Eucharist celebrates. It is worth noting that while John Paul writes that the Church helps individuals to listen for this call to conversion, he also states that the judgment of one's state of grace belongs only to the person involved. The other situation to consider is that of fellow Christians who are not Catholic. The encyclical says, the ecclesial communion of the Eucharistic assembly is a communion with its own bishop and the Roman pontiff. It would therefore be a great contradiction if the sacrament par excellence of the Church's unity were celebrated without true communion with the bishop. Asking non-Catholics to receive the Eucharist is not a matter of withholding grace. Nothing and no one can stop God from sharing God's grace. Rather, the practice stems from our understanding of what the Eucharistic celebration is. It is a sign of communion, which includes communion with the Church worldwide and the authority of the Pope and other bishops. The Eucharist signifies more than just fellowship and goodwill and love. It signifies this unity throughout the Church. To authentically celebrate this unity, it must first exist among those receiving the sacrament. John Paul II established the tradition of ending each encyclical with a meditation on Mary's life and example. He calls Mary a woman of the Eucharist. He writes that there is a profound analogy between the fiat which Mary said in reply to the angel and the amen which every believer says when receiving the body of the Lord. In continuity of the Virgin's faith in the Eucharistic mystery, we are asked to believe that the same Jesus Christ, Son of God and Son of Mary, becomes present in his full humanity and divinity under the signs of bread and wine. When we receive the Eucharist, we demonstrate faith that follows in the footsteps of Mary's faith. We demonstrate this by going forth from the Eucharist, shaping in our lives in a way that allows us to, just like Mary, bear Christ to others.